This video is brought to you by Skillshare, an online learning community for creators with thousands of topics to explore across design, business, art, music, and more. Skillshare is giving away a free trial of Premium to the first 1,000 people who use my link in the description below. More on them in a bit. On the 29th of September 1918, after a ferocious 56-hour artillery bombardment, Allied soldiers finally battered their way through a section of line that had come to symbolize the final German defensive stand. Finally, they were through the Hindenburg Line. It was an action that finally forced the Germans into retreat. Short on food, ammunition, morale, this was a shadow of the army that had fought tooth and nail in France and Belgium during World War I. A few days later, the German government requested an armistice, and on the 8th of October, the final soldiers, still clinging to the Hindenburg Line, were ordered to retreat. The bloodiest war the world had ever known was almost at an end. Though combat would continue for another month, this was the end of the SIEGFRIEDSTELLUNG, also known to the Allies as the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line was a vast German defensive position stretching for 140 kilometers from Arras to La Faux in eastern France. From now on in the video, we're just going to call it the Hindenburg Line, but a little tidbit of information here. The German name comes from Siegfried, a mythical dragon slayer, while Hindenburg was the field marshal who oversaw the line's development. But, as impressive as the line was, it was a reflection of the failing war strategy that Germany began experiencing from 1916. After the chaos of the Somme and the hell of Verdun, the Germans knew they were wobbling. They simply did not have the manpower to withstand much more pressure. The Hindenburg Line was the largest of a series of positions that were created further back from the front line, a fallback position designed to enable them to shorten their lines and so be able to use fewer soldiers. The Hindenburg Line has gone down in history as a formidable defense, but in reality, its life was short-lived. This was an incredibly well-structured defensive position, but it all came far too late for the German army. The carnage that took place in the Somme area of France during the First World War saw casualties top 1 million people, making it one of the bloodiest battles in history. To make it worse, very little, if any, ground was made by either side over the 140 days of the battle. The British Army suffered its biggest single-day loss of life on the first day of the Somme, with nearly 20,000 men dying. The Germans, who remained on the defensive for much of the early stages of the battle, also suffered horrific casualties, but for the most part, their defenses held. Just about. But make no mistake about it, the Germans were in a terrible situation. Any future offensives were out of the question due to a lack of numbers, working weaponry, and just overall battle fatigue. Not only did the Germans have to contend with the Somme, but the Battle of Verdun, which had been anticipated as a shorter offensive, was quickly becoming the longest and most costly battle of the entire war. As if that all wasn't enough, Romania had also joined the war on the side of the Allies, and soldiers would need to be redirected to face another army to the southeast. Quite simply, the front lines had become too long, and the Germans no longer had the manpower to hold them. The idea for a rear defensive line that the Germans would withdraw to was first raised at a conference in the small town of Cambrai, 100 kilometers northeast of Amiens, on the 8th of September. A week before, General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of the General Staff, had been replaced by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who had recently completed an inspection of the front lines. His impression of his soldiers and their defenses was bleak, to say the least. It was at this meeting that Hindenburg told commanders that no extra troops would be made available to them, but that a staunch defense was still to be expected. General Lieutenant George Fuchs was the man who first proposed a new defensive line running from Arras to the west of Laon, which would shorten the front line by 40 kilometers, meaning 10 divisions worth of soldiers could be freed up, possibly to be used in future attacks. A week later, on the 15th of September, the order went out to begin construction of the Hindenburg Line, and work officially started on the 23rd of September. Now, you might not need the skills to build the Hindenburg Line, probably, hopefully, but if you do have other skills that you want to build, well, let me tell you, about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with thousands of topics to explore across the arts and social sciences. Everything from graphic design and animation to marketing skills to UX design to entrepreneurship. If you consider yourself a lifelong learner, well, you should definitely check out Skillshare. And look, you're watching an educational YouTube channel, so that's a good fit. Unlike some platforms where you have to pay for individual topics or classes, Skillshare's premium membership scores you unlimited access to every subject available, so you can discover new skill sets in your own order, at your own pace, which is pretty nice. Now, I'm someone who'll just jump into a particular part of a class, extract what I need to know, and move on. So sites where you have to pay for the whole class just to get one part, they're not for me. I've talked about some classes I've taken before. I recommend those. There's the email productivity class that I took with Alexandra Samuel. There's also just generally building good habits, which I think is a really important part of life. That's taught by Thomas Frank. Both of those are great. There's also a new class, filmmaking from home. Obviously appropriate to me, maybe appropriate to you. All of those are worth checking out. Skillshare is giving away a premium membership to you guys to help you explore your creativity. Just click the link below. That's for the first 1,000 people only. And after that, Skillshare is super affordable at about $10 a month. And let's get back to the video. The Hindenburg Line was only part of the initiative that Field Marshal Hindenburg set in motion towards the end of 1916. Alongside the new defensive position was a wide-ranging set of actions that have come to be known as the Hindenburg Program. This was a program that would focus not on the hellish battlefronts, but back in Germany. It included the Auxiliary Service Law, known back in Deutschland as something that I'm absolutely not going to try and pronounce, but here it is on the screen for your reading pleasure. You could probably see why I didn't even want to attempt that one. Which approved all Germans from 16 to 50 years old for compulsory service. This was designed not only to boost the numbers in the army, but also those working in factories, delivering much-needed munitions and weapons to the battlefield. This was a delicate balancing act that the Germans had serious problems getting right. At the end of 1916, there were 1.2 million skilled workers in German factories who had either been withdrawn from service or were exempt, and that number climbed to 1.64 million by October 1917. But manpower wasn't everything. Throughout the final years of war, Germany suffered serious shortages of raw materials. In February 1917, steel production was 256,000 tons short of their target, while explosives production fell 1,100 tons below expectations. And to give you an idea of just how much firepower was required daily, 34 ammunition trains were needed each day to simply maintain consumption on the Western Front. As I mentioned earlier, construction of the Hindenburg Line began on the 23rd of September 1916, but this was only one of 5 defensive positions that would combine to form the ABWEHRSCHLACHT, the defensive battle. Along with the Hindenburg Line, the Flanders-Stellung, Flanders position, would stretch from the Belgian coast to Lille in France, the Watten-Stellung, Watten position, from Lille to Sailly. The Hunding-Stellung, Hunding position, was to stretch from Peronne to Étampes, while the Michelstellung, Michel position, would thread from Étampes to Pont-à-Mousson. The quality of this line certainly varied depending on where you were. In fact, when the Germans finally made their withdrawal to it, parts hadn't even been finished. In general, it followed the same kind of pattern that we had seen with defensive positions throughout the First World War, but it was not so much of a line as rather a thick wedge of land measuring 12 kilometers deep in certain places. The area behind the line came to be known as the RÜCKWÄRTIGE Kampfzone, rear battle zone, which the Germans hoped would be able to slow or even stall in advance should it make it through the line. This would be done through booby traps, flooded rivers, destroyed bridges, and so on. At the back of this area was the artillery, which would rain down fire on any Allied advance. Concrete pillar boxes were installed along the entirety of the Hindenburg Line, with the feared German machine guns lurking in wait. The area around the line was designed in such a way that troops could quickly withdraw and then counterattack at speed, and this was part of a general evolution in German military planning, which called for a much more fluid approach to defense instead of the rigid hold the line at all costs mantra which had been seen earlier in the war. The Hindenburg Line was built by German construction companies who began focusing on the ferro-concrete emplacements and pillar boxes. These were made with a combination of wire mesh and concrete. The Mulberry harbours that the Allies used on D-Day were built in the same way and remain on the beaches of Normandy to this day. The amount of gravel, sand and cement needed was so much that it exhausted production in occupied France, Belgium and the west of Germany. Roughly 12,000 Germans and 3,000 Belgian labourers were recruited, along with around 50,000 prisoners of war, most of whom are Russian, who were digging the trenches. The Hindenburg Line measured 140 kilometers and was designed to accommodate 20 divisions, each usually composed of between 10,000 and 15,000 men. This meant that there would be one division every 7.2 kilometers. Telephone lines were buried along the entire line, but also stretched back to deeper positions. The line was composed of two main trenches, roughly 180 meters apart. The second trench was considered the main line of defense, and it was here that the majority of the soldiers would be based. In front of the trenches was barbed wire with fields of it, sometimes as much as 91 meters deep, and it was positioned in a zigzag formation which would allow the machine guns placed behind to be able to sweep the sides, so to maximize casualties. Building a huge defensive line further back was one thing, but how do you safely move hundreds of thousands of troops back to it without leaving gaps? Luckily for the Germans, they had winter on their side, and with little appetite for an Allied offensive during the end of 1916, discussions began over how the withdrawal would take place. Come January, most agreed that the Allied strength was both too great to be defeated through an offensive and perhaps even too strong for the German defenders to hold them at bay. Allied commanders had been careful not to visibly amass troops in any certain areas, which would have indicated where an attack might take place, and would have at least allowed the Germans to reinforce the sectors. Instead, according to German surveillance, it appeared that Allied forces were gaining strength across the front line. The time to withdraw was closing in. A complex plan of deception was laid out with the hope of throwing off the Allies, and to a degree it worked. The Allies were at least in part convinced that a limited offensive was about to take place further north in Flanders or possibly nearer to the Channel ports, but this was simply a ruse to mask one of the most complex military withdrawals of the war. The German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line came to be known as the ALBERICH maneuver, and it came with a 35-day timetable in which everything needed to be moved from the forward lines or destroyed. German commanders also ordered plenty of booby traps to be laid throughout the old defensive positions. These traps ranged from the fairly straightforward buried devices to the more complex, with delayed action fuses often attached to useful devices such as stoves or to items likely to be taken by Allied soldiers as loot. The Allies countered this by often sending captured German soldiers into the enemy trenches first, where they were ordered to scour for booby traps. On top of this, roads had to be damaged, bridges destroyed, water supplies contaminated, and the civilian population was forced to leave, although certain villagers were given exceptions out of fear that scorched earth tactics might provoke a strong backlash, which, after 3 years of war on French soil, sounds, well, a little rich. Troops began moving on the 16th of March 1917. Reserve soldiers were brought up from behind the new Hindenburg Line and took their place on the main defensive line, while the shattered soldiers on the front line began moving back behind the Hindenburg Line. It was a large-scale, choreographed dance routine set in an area of the world that was beginning to look like the end of the world. Vast swaths of land had been completely destroyed, with thousands of bodies swallowed up by the hellish winter mud. If there was a hell, well, it was here. Over the next month, a bizarre cat-and-mouse game ensued as the Germans took a step forward, then 2 steps back, nearing the Hindenburg Line with every passing day. As early as the 14th of March, the Allies had an inkling that the Germans were retreating, but to where, they were still not sure. It was a chaotic time when casualties across the board began to mount, but by early April, the two sides had met on a new battlefront: the Hindenburg Line. The battle to break the Hindenburg Line began almost immediately and with some success. On the 3rd of May, an Australian division reached the line and briefly gained control before being forced back. This was a pattern that was replicated many times in the coming months, with the Allies throwing everything they had at the line. On the rare occasion they did reach it or surpass it, they often became caught in the rear battle zone, giving the Germans the opportunity to counterattack. As summer dragged on, Allied casualties climbed steadily, with little to no gains to show for it. But as August began, a series of massive attacks were being planned which would eventually end the war. Collectively, they came to be known as the 100-day offensive. Now, remember, the Germans were in a poor state at this point, and their initial success at holding the Allies at bay probably said more about the quality of the Hindenburg Line rather than the German army. Britain's General Rawlinson even wrote, "Had it been defended by the Germans of 2 years ago, it certainly would have been impregnable." But the pressure was mounting, and on the 28th of September 1918, the Grand Offensive began. The cataclysmic finale of the Great War was here, and the following day, the main assault on the Hindenburg Line commenced. The fighting over the following week was fierce. Allied soldiers would battle through the defensive line, only to be pushed back, and it wasn't until the 5th of October that they began streaming through the Hindenburg Line over a 31-kilometer front. 3 days later, the British 1st and 3rd Armies also breached the line, and on the same day, German commanders ordered the full withdrawal from their prized defensive position. 36,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner in the attack as the full extent of the German capitulation became clear. Their armies slumped backwards towards their homeland, desperately fighting a rearguard action. It is perhaps one of the most shocking aspects of the entire First World War that bloody combat continued right up until the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918. The last known soldier to die in combat was American Henry Gunther, who was killed just 1 minute before the armistice came into effect. The carnage that had lasted since 1914 finally came to an end. As for the Hindenburg Line, what was undoubtedly a formidable defensive position came far too late for a Germany that was already frantically holding on at that point. With its soldiers in terrible shape, low on ammunition, and morale collapsing, many argue that the breaching of the line was the final nail in the coffin, which led to any remaining German hope evaporating both on the battlefield and back in Germany. Others claim that even the construction of the Hindenburg Line and subsequent withdrawal to it caused some serious damage to German prestige. In 1916, Germany had little hope of winning the war, but what they could do was make it as hard as possible for the Allied forces to win. This was not the glorious German army that had long been touted. What had been billed as a defiant stand lasted less than 7 months and accounted for tens of thousands of deaths. The bloody, hopeless defense of the Hindenburg Line was just the closing chapter of what had been the most brutal war of attrition the world had ever seen. So I do hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. If you've got a suggestion for us for a future video, please do let me know in the comments below. I do read them, look at them for what future videos to make. Also, if you'd like to support this show, that would be fantastic. You can do that by supporting our fantastic sponsor, Skillshare, who I've included a link to in the description below. And thank you for watching.